Hello, everyone. Caresoft would like to welcome you to our Vectra AI webinar. Caresoft is a trusted government IT solutions provider delivering software and support solutions to federal, state, and local agencies. Caresoft maintains dedicated teams to support sales and marketing for all of its vendors, including Vectra AI, Splunk, Okta, AWS, Forescout, and VMware. At this time, I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Robert Marcoux, Federal Principal Technologist at Vectra AI. Robert, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Alex. Appreciate it. Let me share my screen here and we'll get started. Good afternoon and welcome. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you for allowing me to take up a couple of minutes of your time today to talk about Vectra AI and Journey to Zero Trust. Just quick agenda. I've tried to maintain a vendor agnostic approach throughout this entire presentation. At least the first part of it is going to be vendor agnostic. I realize there are individuals that have varying disciplines here. So I've sprinkled in enough content to hopefully make this a value add for everyone involved. What we're going to start with is defining what is zero trust. That's kind of hard. It's a conversation. So really getting started with this is a lot like driving a diesel truck on a really cold day. You first have to have a conversation. So you have to understand why zero trust, what are you planning, what's your protect surface, and then you have to build out policies. So building out zero trust policies will be the second portion of this. Then zero trust telemetry and controls, we'll get into why that's important. Mapping Vectra AI to zero trust environments and Vectra AI differentiation. So I figured I'd start here. We were given this as sort of the NIST requirement in terms of zero trust capabilities model. And as you can see, it looks like, I appreciate the care that's gone into this document, but it seems a lot like every vendor has been asked for their input into this document, because it seems like every technology solution under the sun is part of this capability model. So, but for our purposes, we're going to limit this discussion to core capabilities directly related to SOC operations and incident response. And for the most part, Vectra AI's positioning with regard to the capabilities models will be limited to AI under the automation and orchestration piece, visibility and analytics, so with the machine learning, threat protection, monitoring and auditing, and some user controls as well. So,
hey, Robert,
yes.
one question
Yes.
here. Yeah. It says here, in your opinion, what is the biggest misconception about zero trust?
Good question. So the biggest misconception about zero trust, in my opinion, is that it's a product. Zero trust is more or less a conversation. So first we have to determine, and it's a great opportunity actually to have a conversation and understand more about not just the requirements, but what the customer's end state looks like and what its existing state looks like and how you can augment that. So in a lot of ways, there are a lot of identity management products that'll come in, for instance, and say, just deploy Duo, for example, and you're zero trust. That's not true. And hopefully, by the time we're done with this, you'll understand why that's not true. Is that helpful?
Yes, thank you.
Great. So we'll start by saying, to understand zero trust, let's go to the experts. So no one understands more in the world what zero trust is as a concept than the Secret Service president's detail. At all times, they have to know who the president is, where the president is, and who should have access? The president and his immediate family. So the president and their immediate family is the attack surface here, or the protect surface, depending on your perspective. Just a quick note on this. You see that this is the president's caravan. We have some controls set up where we are guarding the protect surface. We have established a micro perimeter. We have this monitoring component. And notice that where we have positioned most of our dollars in terms of IT spend with regard to cybersecurity, that's actually an afterthought. I know the DC police would probably disagree, but these individuals here are sort of contracted out and their eyes are maintained outward. So this would be your perimeter security, but the core investment is actually internal. And these are just the people that we see. We're not counting the people hiding in plain sight, people on the roof, et cetera. So with that in mind, let's explore. So first you have to have the conversation that says, what does zero trust mean to you? How can we define it? And we have to establish that first before we can continue. So in order to get people on the same page, I could sort of proffer that access to resources are controlled based on a number of conditions. So is the device managed or unmanaged? What is the device health? What's the user privilege? Are there any behavioral factors going on with the account or the device that we need to be concerned with? And is there any threat intelligence that we have that requires us to change this? The biggest benefit of zero trust is that it can be dynamic and change based on any of these conditions changing. So in essence, the end state or the utopia is that we have a living, breathing network that changes based on telemetry that we receive that's contrary to what we knew maybe a day ago, a minute ago, an hour ago. And enforcement takes place at multiple points on the network rather than just keeping everything, firewalling everything off. We have to open up some certain boundaries and we have to look a little bit closer at things the closer they get to our protected resources. So why do we want to go to zero trust? Well, because we want to harden ourselves from attackers. And what does that do for us? What does it mean for an attacker to encounter a zero trust network? Well, the good elements of being in zero trust or being a true zero trust when it comes to your protect surface is some attacks become too hard or impossible. We're going to go into the number of controls and why that is. Multi-factor authentication can make password theft less valuable, at least for common users. Phishing will need to become more sophisticated. So we're seeing attacks on MFA today. That will continue likely, and it'll become more sophisticated. Attackers will need to move faster, which is good. It's actually a good thing because the more noise that's made, the more likely they will surface. So the easier there will be to catch. The bad, and this is going to be a recurring theme, cloud pivoting becomes more attractive. It's more desirable because of the persistence. Attackers know this. Attackers know that that's where the data is. So why not pivot directly there? We're seeing in the field today, you get access to the on-prem network. The first thing you do is go into the cloud. That's where you can hide easier. A lot of that is due to misconfigurations. The lack of cloud homogenization makes security controls challenging. Security controls are different for each cloud provider. So you may have a multi-cloud hybrid environment where you have Azure, you have Google Cloud, and you have AWS. Each one of those requires a select skill set to configure and secure. And you're going to have a lot of chefs in the kitchen. It's going to be hard to be consistently capable across that discipline, across the three major cloud providers. So the chances are that there's going to be some misconfigurations or holes are likely. The lack of cross-cloud telemetry is another reason. So Azure isn't going to report on AWS. So you're going to have to aggregate a lot of this data back to SIM, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem. You're going to have to create logic in SIM that's going to be able to cobble together an instance that begins in Azure and migrates into your AWS instance. As you can imagine, this is going to become cumbersome. So you're going to need to be fleet of foot as far as your logging and your telemetry data and understanding your cloud environment, even more so than you do your on-prem. How do I zero trust? So you have to start somewhere. And the best place to start is understanding where your protect surface is and building out from there. It's not necessary to zero trust everything. You can start with just your enterprise domain controllers as an example, or maybe you're dipping your feet into the water with your cloud environment. So you can start by zero trust in the cloud. Once you've defined the protect surface, then you can start to build in telemetry and logging to ensure that you have the capability there to protect that surface. Mapping transactional flows. So these machines aren't going to be cut off from the world at large. They're going to need to talk to each other. And you're going to need to understand the manner in which they communicate with each other in order to say, okay, this is normal. I need to allow this, and I need to ensure for this connectivity. And then this is not normal, or anything that looks like this, don't allow that. Then you're going to have to build it out. Building that out involves creating a policy. And the Kipling methodology is one that's espoused by John Kindervag, who is oftentimes called the father of zero trust, which is great. And we'll get into that in the next slide here. And then you're going to monitor and maintain the protect surfaces. So it's like getting a physical. You don't just create a zero trust architecture, button it up, and say, okay, we're done. You have to routinely monitor it to ensure that your zero trust policies are working. There are some things that are going to change. The environment's going to be dynamic. So you're going to need to continuously change it. And just because we're declaring that we don't trust the network doesn't mean we're not going to verify what's happening. So rather than the old adage, which was trust but verify, it's going to be now do not trust, but still verify.
Hey, Robert.
Yes.
One more question here that we've
Sure.
gotten. It says, why is network visibility so important in zero trust when I explicitly do not trust the network?
That's great. I'm glad you asked that. So as you can probably imagine, if we're not trusting the network, first I need to establish what's normal. And in order to establish what's normal, I need to gather telemetry data before I can even begin to build out zero trust. And for a lot of agencies, they're really good at understanding what should enter and leave the network because we've become so perimeter centric. They have no idea what's happening inside, east-west. So it's a great place to start gathering metadata telemetry and understanding who communicates with what as it pertains to what you plan to protect, and then building out, scaling out from there, using your other security controls to restrict access to these six honest people, which is a great transition to this. So in creating zero trust policies, we need to know who should be accessing the protected resource, what applications are being used, when the resource is being accessed, if we're going to create time-based constraints, where is the protected resource? Is it in the cloud? Is it on-prem? Why are you accessing the resource and how? So this is what's called the Kipling methodology, otherwise known as the six honest people. And yes, it is Rudyard Kipling, the author of the Jungle Book. Then you can begin to build out your matrix. So I've got a really oversimplified use case here, but examining this, then you can kind of sort of understand why you need this telemetry, why it becomes important to build this out. And then you're going to continually monitor this to make sure that the policy is working. So when I'm writing this rule, maybe I have a rule that says, I want to allow AWS administration, but I want to allow it only when it's coming from on-prem. So in other words, if I'm a remote administrator, I need to first invoke, either my ZPA client, and from on-prem, I can leverage AWS Direct Connect to get into the cloud and do administration of the AWS control plane. So there's just two rules that say from here it's unauthorized. So I have restrictions in the AWS environment that doesn't allow connectivity unless it's coming from on-prem or through my on-prem. So hopefully now we've at least established the need for that type of control. And so when we get into these zero trust controls, we need to define what they are. What do I have at my disposal? And a lot of agencies will have some of these today. In fact, most of these. So endpoint detect and response. We need an agent on any endpoint that'll take an agent. So we can determine if there are any malicious processes that are running on hosts, any changes that are going to cause us to raise our level of suspicion on that endpoint. Network detect and response, equally important. There are ways to defeat endpoint, so we want to make sure we maintain our defense in depth. We also want network detect and response for the reasons I cited earlier, because network detect and response can deliver that metadata telemetry that'll tell us who talks to what and where, so that we can begin to establish the zero trust. And then we also need network detect and response for things that won't take an agent: legacy devices, IoT devices, OT devices. Microsegmentation will be an element. There's another falsehood that microsegmentation is zero trust. Not necessarily. Depending on your protection profile, microsegmentation may be a component, but is it in and of itself zero trust? No. So with microsegmentation, obviously you can limit the network scale and size to restrict it just to certain elements can only talk to this element. MFA is a big piece. We talked about that, and we'll get into that a little bit more. Network access control, .1x for wireless as well as wired. This way we can provide telemetry-based conditional access based on your machine, whether it's a government-owned machine or whether it's a personal use machine. You may have different policies for that. So we need to allow for that. Secure access, so something like Zscaler or your VPN, and then leveraging bastion hosts. So those are some of the controls. Instrumentation. So putting the cart before the horse, we definitely want to collect instrumentation and understand our network before we even begin to zero trust. So I've kind of carved this up into what I think are what I call the planes of importance. So we're going to collect packet telemetry. And I'll show you what this looks like logically and physically here in a second, but we need to create a packet plane. So packet brokering is an excellent way to do this. We can actually grab our infrastructure packets without impacting real-time traffic and forward them off to the tools that actually can help us. So we get the right information to the right tools. Packet brokering can be a great way to establish a packet plane, get the packets into the network monitoring and threat detection devices. Log telemetry, logging plane. A lot of places, your logging plane might be your SIM, but there are other tools, and we'll take a look at one of them that has a capability to grab the logs and provide sort of this Swiss Army knife capability, similar to what a packet broker does, but a logging broker, something like a Cribble. API tooling. So this is the part where a lot of vendors fall short. We need to make sure that we're getting what we need from the customer in terms of establishing what the end state should look like, even if it requires professional services after the fact. But these tools need to effectively talk to each other, because we don't need more events, we need smarter events. And an API tooling telemetry will help turn this network into a living, breathing network like we want it to be. Identity telemetry. So there's your IAM plane, there's your identity. and then your UAVA, should you decide to deploy that as well. Asset inventory and machine posture assessment for IPAM and things like vulnerability databases, scanning, et cetera. Are there any questions so far?
We have one here that I'd like to go over.
Sure.
It's very brief. Says, how does cloud impact my zero trust strategy?
Great. So if you're moving to cloud, you may think you may kind of be lulled into a false sense of security that you have a cloud provider. There's a lot of restrictions initially with cloud, so you don't have to open things up so much. But there's misconfigurations is probably the number one reason, for the reasons I cited earlier, which is maintaining that discipline across. Now we have so many different cloud providers. Oracle is in the game. GCP is moving up, but right now it's just the big two, Azure and AWS. And then what people don't often think about is the cloud control plane. So we're so used to looking at traffic as it traverses the network, because we see and touch machines physically and virtually in our network and interact with them in a different way than when we spin up workloads in the cloud. And that's sort of, well, not sort of, it's actually invisible to the network sensors at large. So we need to have that logging capability attached to this that understands what roles users are assuming, what workloads they're spinning up, what ones they're spinning down, and why, so we can check against that to understand what's normal and what's not. Is that helpful?
Yes, that was perfect. Thank you.
Great. So I established the packet plane, the logging plane. Now what I'm going to do is help you understand with Vectra AI what elements we can kind of help you check off in each one of these planes that we're talking about, where we need to take in telemetry to monitor and establish a zero trust. So on the packet plane side, that's an easy one, right? That's Vectra's core value prop. Essentially taking in network traffic and producing events based on our ML models that model to attacker behaviors, as well as provide that capability and extension in cloud. And then we have the SASE logging capability that'll give you that visibility in a single screen to show you what's happening in your M365 environment. And then we transition into the logging plane, where we're providing log enrichment. So we have SIM integrations where we're sending traffic logs into SIM, allowing you to create your own custom detections. We'll have a signature capability that we can layer onto this as well. So we can provide logging events whenever we observe things that violate those signature mechanisms. Smarter logs, so integrating with EDR. So NDR and EDR together, providing a better prioritized log event based on what EDR knows about the host, and then an NDR event will lead to analysts being less burdened by trying to figure out what sense to make of all of these inputs that are coming in, this sort of confluence of events. And then we have the AWS and Azure control plane threat telemetry. So any changes that are being made in your AWS or Azure environment that reflect things that you might need to be aware of, or things that hit on some of our machine learning algorithms in there, will definitely fire in there. On the API and tooling plane, these are the controls and countermeasures. So the idea of automated Jira and ServiceNow ticketing. So this is all part of getting that integration into the network and providing that sort of living, breathing element that allows ticketing to occur. I've observed a collection of detections on a specific host, and based on some rule set or through orchestration, we can get a ticket created for a specific set of detections as a singular event. Data sharing across tool sets. So you have APIs talking to each other. You have EDR getting data from NDR, NDR doing likewise, getting data from EDR. And then you can introduce countermeasures here. So dynamic blocking using some of those controls that we talked about earlier. On the IAM or identity plane side, what Vectra does have, and this goes beyond the scope of this particular conversation, but I'm happy to engage in a deeper dive in a demo to show you Vectra's privilege access model. So our software understands the difference between observed privilege and granted privilege, and it will fire accordingly. Just because I have domain admin privileges, I do have a job, and my role entails that I touch certain things. I may not touch everything. I may be working on a specific project, and this is just a broad example, and that may require me to touch specific things at this time. So if I deviate from that, that could be something interesting. So these are things that Vectra's software looks at. On the identity side as well, we can tie the IAM role back to the specific API user in both AWS and Azure. And then also we provide M365 account-based detections. Azure and AD Microsoft integrations. So you can get account attribution, which is greater than what you get with existing NDR, which is attribution back to a IP address, which is arbitrary and can change, as we well know. I see that there's a question. Would you mind?
Of course. This question says, how does Vectra manage identity and authentication for purely machine-to-machine processes, where this is no human identity backing the workflow?
So the way Vectra manages identity is we tie that back to the host. If there is no actual, what we would call probable owner of the machine, so no actual, it's more of a headless device, there's no actual owner, it would be the same as an IoT device. So we're going to fall back to, if it can take an agent, we'll rely on the artifacts, just like it says here in the asset inventory. We'll rely on things we call host ID artifacts. So things that are in the database, either an IPAM database or in an EDR database of what that host is. In the absence of any of that, because we're wire-based, what we're going to listen in on is the conversations. So if it's a Windows machine, we can listen in on Kerberos information and maybe determine something like a machine name. If it's a machine that's enabled for DHCP, we can fetch the MAC address from a DHCP broadcast packet, reverse DNS. So hopefully anything other than the IP address, which would be the default. Is that helpful?
Yes, and then we also have another question here that says, does Vectra monitor and verify established sessions and reauthentication?
So we're not identity management. We're more a network detect and response tool. So from that aspect, I would say no. Hopefully that's helpful.
Those are all the questions we have so far.
Okay. And then finally, on the asset inventory side, we talked a little bit about how Vectra collects its host ID artifacts. We did talk a little bit about EDR integrations, some other ways that we can integrate with EDR, our host lockdown. Let's see here. Oh, was helpful. Okay, great. And then host lockdown feature can be turned on either via integration with EDR or Active Directory. So we can lock out the host through Active Directory also. It's part of that API tooling. So what does this look like? And I threw in some names of some vendors here so that you could kind of visualize that in a perfect world, what this might look like. Obviously, we're going to put Vectra here as the NDR because I'm a Vectra employee and we're doing a Vectra talk. But there are other competitors, obviously, and we welcome the challenge there. We have the API and logging plane here. So we're exchanging logs both between solutions and then exchanging them to the SIM as well. And then we have API tooling that provides the connective tissue between NDR, EDR, if we need to reach out to firewalls to do layer 3 blocking based on some behavior-based changes, that's there. AV, talked about a little bit about the Active Directory integrations as well as NAC. Zscaler. Zscaler is another way that we can take in logging data. So as you can probably imagine, and I'll get to it more in the next slide, which is more of a physical topology. Just kind of wanted to show you what this looks like. I think this slide is actually much better in terms of visualizing how this all comes together. And this is just a single site just to stimulate some conversation on exactly what we're talking about when we talk about extrapolating this data. So for the purposes of this, I said, let's have something like a Gigamon become the packet plane. So we have all of the packet data going into Gigamon, and naturally it doesn't need to, you can have your packet brokering presence out here. So it's more logical in that regard, but you're collecting in this packet data and aggregating it into what's called a packet fabric. And from here, you can make the decision which tools you want to send this packet data to. So we selected NDR, and we have some on-demand or full-time always-on PCAP like Archimay as a solution here. And then we've got logging telemetry that we need to take in. So we have control plane logs coming from our cloud presence. We have logging that's coming in from our M365 environment, EDR logs, in the Zscaler instantiation, because you're going in through a gateway to get onto the network. Everything's going to look the same when you're on this side of that network. So how do we make the distinction? Well, the integration between Zscaler and Vectra, the API integration there allows us to parse the logs and determine user attribution. So when we make a network detection, we're instead not going to pin it to a host, we're actually going to pin it to an account. So regardless of what device they're using, we'll pin it to that user account. And in this case, I've used Cribble in this particular customer use case. They had Cribble. So Cribble really does for logs what Gigamon does for packets. So essentially like a Swiss Army knife, they take a lot of this log data in, run it through pipelines, and sort of make it smarter so that you can integrate right here at this logging aggregation fabric, EDR and NDR logs into a single stream of consciousness rather than two separate and distinct log events. You can enrich that into one common view or one common log event. However you need to manipulate that data, you can, and it can take in obviously multiple different sources. And the API bus providing sort of the connective tissue between all of these vendor solutions to talk to each other. And again, the idea behind it being more smarter events, really. Because the issue here isn't just the amount of events that we see, it's how do we make them smarter? So let's say, go ahead.
One more question here.
Sure.
Yes. This question here says, given that ZTA requires multiple products integrated and working with each other, where can I start to make the most initial impact?
Yeah, and although it might seem like I'm biased when I suggest this, I won't necessarily. I'll forego saying Vectra, but what I will say is an excellent starting point would be some type of metadata collection mechanism. So network metadata is probably where you're going to want to start, because the easiest thing in the world to do is unplug an Ethernet cable from a host and make it secure. But these machines need to talk to things. So you need to understand that as a foundation. And the best way to do that is have a tool that collects and gathers metadata. So that's where I would start. And it just so happens that Vectra does do that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Awesome.
So where will attackers focus once we sort of realize this world of zero trust, if we're to do this? And this is another reason why we want to do this, is because as we established a little earlier on, when we talked about the good and the bad, when it comes to zero trust, is that it will become resource and cost prohibitive for enthusiasts to try to hack your network. So really, we're going to sort of wall ourselves off or insulate ourselves from anything but the most sophisticated, the nation state attackers, the ones we really want to worry about anyway, the corporate espionage people, the insider threat, Edward Snowdens of the world, et cetera. So with that in mind, what else is there? What would be left? So agent-based software might be one area of focus, attacking the EDR surface, but the impact might be limited. Obviously, it would depend on the host, and it would depend on what other controls were in place, because in an ideal world, our zero trust would be dynamic enough to be able to ferret out when these things occur and when our hosts begin to exhibit behaviors that we're not accustomed to. API keys and tokens would be a big issue, and anything post-MFA, actually, because APIs have been built with full trust in mind. So APIs might be an area of focus for attackers, buggy and insecure ones especially, to at least at first gather information. And then who knows beyond that point. So that would be an area of focus. We want to define what those attack surfaces will be, because they will still be there. Even when we button up zero trust and monitor it, these things will still be out there. Misconfigurations are going to be at the top of the list. So exposed resources, misconfigured permissions. You won't believe, I'm in the field all the time with my customers and with federal agencies especially. You won't believe the number of times where we're setting up a cloud POC and I'm having a conversation and the individual tells me they were the guy that shadowed the main cloud guy, but the cloud guy left, and now they have these new responsibilities in addition to what they had prior to this, and it's been thrust upon them, and they're still learning. There's nothing wrong with learning, but the problem is we're dealing with real live networks here, and exposed resources could be disastrous. So cloud infrastructure, we talked a little bit about how Vectra can glean cloud telemetry from the control plane to alert you when things are happening that we don't expect. Other than that, the cloud infrastructure itself, CPU or chipset flaws. So we've seen Meltdown Inspector as examples of that. Expect that to continue. Identity provider attacks. So actually attacking MFA, the Evil Gen X2 and MFA fatigue. MFA fatigue being one that I'll cover here that we've just seen recently, which is, we're lulled into this false sense of security where we know we're going to get a push notification if our account has been compromised. So if we get an unexpected push, we can know to call our security team or our help desk or whoever's responsible for making sure that we reset our passwords, et cetera. But this MFA fatigue attack involves just brute force hammering MFA push notifications to users to create this environment where they may actually wind up accidentally pressing authorize or yes. So it's crude, I know, but in times of desperation, these are what attackers will get up to. The certificate authority is one area of attack that concerns me, because many organizations, even still today, for as long as it's been around, still struggle with their secret management. Supply chain attacks, SolarGate's still out there. I anticipate that that's just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to see more of them, and I have an example of that here coming up. But there are always exceptions too. The CEO's laptop, service accounts, legacy systems, OT and IoT, where you can't take an agent. These will all be prime targets in a zero trust environment. Are there any questions there before I move on to the next? Because now we're going to get more into the Vectra core value prop in a zero trust environment.
No questions as of right now.
Okay, just a quick time check to make sure. So for decades now, the IT spend in terms of budget has either been on prevention or forensics. So on the left-hand side, we can see all the prevention dollars, everything focused around preventing initial access or initial compromise. And then on the right-hand side, what do we do when we're investigating an incident or trying to make sure that that incidents don't sprawl? And we've created this security gap. I was way back in a past life. I was a security analyst for the MCNOSC. That name is long since passed, for the Marine Corps. And they used to have a saying, we're hard on the outside and we're chewy in the center. Well, that mindset needs to change. We need to understand more about what our devices are doing internally. Otherwise, we'll continue to have this big green box. It's defined as the security gap. And what are these attacks, these newer attacks, these supply chain attacks? Let's see, I have a question here. Came in. Thank you. Great. Let's see. So the security gap here, in terms of what this looks like when you're experiencing an actual event that is related to supply chain compromise. So we've got the green box kind of highlighted, and this is exactly sort of the breakdown of the sunburst event. But it doesn't need to be limited to the sunburst event. This can be, SolarWinds has been beaten up enough by this. I'm using this only as an example. Expect this kind of behavior to persist. It's just they've sort of are wearing the crown for this, unfortunately, but this could have been anyone. So we know now that we've looked back at this, that the update contained a malicious DLL that waited for a time, and what it did was validate the environment. And in this case, environment validation entailed a number of different host lookup mechanisms to determine whether or not it was running on an administrator's machine or a lab or / test environment. First, it wanted to determine that if there were any host agents on the machine, et cetera, because it didn't want to give itself away if it was going to be quickly ferreted out. And part of that involved an LDAP lookup, which we can observe with Vectra. And then once the environment is validated, it beaconed back out using a domain name that looked innocuous enough. And if you didn't have your goggles on or had no way of detecting C2, it might have passed over. You might have passed over that glance of that particular event. And then ultimately, what was decided upon once hands got on keyboard, a secondary C2 was established. There was some file renaming and some tools that were sent down to the device, some reconnaissance conducted against Active Directory. And then this is where it kind of gets a little bit messy, is they pivoted directly into the cloud from there once they gained Windows admin. So they went into the O365 environment, not just because the visibility there is limited, but also that's where the data lives. That's where the emails are. That's where SharePoint is. That's where Teams is. So there's a lot of data there that you can either embarrass or share with the world that, quite frankly, no one wants you to share, or at least anyone that's working for any one of these agencies that were compromised. So using forged SAML tokens, gained admin access privileges in O365, modified the federation for trust. Each one of these is a detection, by the way, in Vectra Detect for O365 along the way, created additional admin accounts so that they could maintain persistence, created an e-discovery looking for specific keywords, things like patent, secret, you name it. E-discovery is a feature within O365, but attackers can use these features too. Look for anything labeled this, create this sort of e-discovery search, and then exfiltrate this via Power Automate. So this process took a number of months, as you can see here, from March to December, before it was ferreted out in a lot of these agencies. And as you can see, a majority of this occurred in that blind spot that we're referring to.
Hey,
So
Robert, we
go
have
ahead.
another question.
Sure.
Yes, it says, how does machine learning fit into the overall enterprise zero trust strategy?
That's a great question. And hopefully I can address that in these next few slides, because that's exactly where we're going with this, is being able to surface attacker behavior based on the MITRE attack framework, which is TTPs, rather than some of these other mechanisms that you see in front of you here, is really the only way to provide as few false positives as possible with almost no false negatives. So I have before you depicted the pyramid of pain, and this has been around. I think the first time in my source here is from 2013 from the SANS Institute. I think it's been around even longer than that. And the pyramid is a depiction of the parameters used for detection. Alongside it are the ease in which it is for an attacker to outmaneuver these techniques. So at the very bottom, you have these hash values. Hash values are great. They're probably the most certain indicator that something wrong has occurred, but they're also the easiest to manipulate. In fact, so much so, there's an entire detection technique built around the so-called fuzzy hashes that look for hash values that are similar to known bad hashes. So, and then not to mention the fact that if you're seeing malware file hashes being passed on your network, you're probably too late. Chances are the attacker has a pretty good foothold at this point. So that is relatively trivial. All you need to do is essentially change value in a file, and it's its own brand new hash. That may be caught by fuzzy hash values, but it also may not be. It may be a different file altogether, or a new 0-day file, and then you're left at square one. IP addresses are just as easy to change. Domain names, the same. Network host and artifacts, also pretty easy to change. And then when you get into tools, it's a little bit more challenging, right? But there are always newer and newer tools being exchanged over the dark web, being stood up. So really, it comes down to tactics, techniques, and procedures, and are the things that an attacker needs to do. And I know this reads like a human eye chart, but one of the things just to consider is that this can range from, and instead of being a singular IOC, as I'll present here in a few minutes, from just at a moment on the wire to a collection of detection related events that tell a greater story and build a narrative around what's actually happening here. So the pyramid of pain is the challenge. And then overlapping with that, what I've decided to provide here is Vectra coverage versus competitor coverage. So it's important when you're evaluating solutions that make claims about machine learning, you must take care, because oftentimes you'll find that the solution is a combination, unfortunately, of threat intelligence and general purpose algorithms. And I'll explain why that is ineffective for this purpose. But for now, just understand that until we get the signature capability bolted on, which will be, I think, end of Q1 next year, we're limited to IP addresses and up. But the more important part is on the competitor side, pay particular attention to what they're keying on, what the detections are coming in as a result of, because I think oftentimes what you'll find is once you clear through and scratch beneath the surface, a lot of this is based on threat intelligence, and threat intelligence is something that someone already knows. So what good does it do you against 0 day or something new? So how do we do it? We have this approach here called the no free lunch theorem. So it's a security-led approach versus a math-led approach. And an example of a math-led approach is we have all of this data. Why don't we just use a general purpose algorithm like DB-scan to surface interesting things? And that's great. You're probably going to be effective at maybe catching 50% of the things that you let out to catch. And that's on a good day. The other approach is a security-led approach, which says, covert channels are frequently used by nation state attacks. How can we leverage data science to build a detection algorithm for this in software? So hopefully that, and then the next few slides will kind of illustrate why that's so important and why that's the foundation of what we do here at Vectra AI. But what this slide is essentially telling you is we marry the best of both worlds. We take in log data from different sources here. We talked a little bit about it, O365, Azure AD, AWS, flow-based logs, so for your metadata, and Zscaler and other vendors. That's just a few there. And then packet data. Packet data, whether it's virtual, physical, doesn't matter where it's coming from. It's machines talking to machines. And then what we've delivered is we have threat research on our side. So threat researchers are sort of leading this. They're monitoring nation state events. They're monitoring the APT landscape. They're constantly looking at new attack surfaces, or how would they begin? These are guys that have experience in that world, and understanding that, and then communicating that back to data science and turning this into a math problem that we can solve in software. And that's where you get, that's the nexus from where you get our detections, where they're derived from. So what is an example of that? So an example of a math-led approach would be, we have these simple anomalies and we have static IOCs. So things like bad domains. Let's create a detection based on an unusual number of HTTPS connections. The unfortunate part about that is if the user browses more, it can result in a false positive. If the tunnel connections are low relative to the user, it can result in a false negative. So you're not really capturing what you want here. Another approach would be ML enhanced signatures. So now I've taken all of the steps from step one, and I'm rolling that up into another math-led approach, which is now I'm going to look for SSL beaconing to rare destinations, because beaconing requires some sort of machine learning to be able to establish when a beacon occurs. And then based on the approximation of the tunnel, you'll have false positive and false negative problems. Finally, the security-led approach, which is developing the AI model that says, let's develop an HTTPS tunnel detector. This way we can directly detect the behavior of interest in an accurate way. How do we do that? So I've lined this up and for it to be a little bit entertaining, because I knew we were getting to the end of the presentation and a lot of brains might be a little foggy. So rather than use tunnels, and I'm sure many of you have seen this on the internet, I've used chihuahuas and blueberry muffins. So in an example here, suspend a little bit of reality and just imagine you're an analyst and you're given the charge of determining in a field of millions and millions of chihuahuas to find 1,000 blueberry muffins. It'd be hard to do as a human, especially at this volume in sub-second timing. So what we do is we train a recurrent neural network to be able to do this for you. So imagine these are labeled tunnel samples, and then there's normalized HTTP traffic being injected in here as well. And along the line, we have these little nodes here that have little indicators. In this case, easier to be able to kind of describe this as this node might be measuring the separation between the black dots on the chihuahua and the muffin. So one might be an indicator that it's a muffin, the other might be an indicator that it's a chihuahua. And so when we get to the very end where the machine provides its answer, it'll say, this is a muffin. And then we'll reinforce that by saying, yes, you're right. If it needs to relearn the pattern and comes back and says, this is a muffin, and it isn't a muffin, it's a chihuahua, we'll tell the machine this. So the answer is incorrect. And that's why this recurrent network. So it goes back and it retrains itself. Hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So we do this with tunnels or covert channels to be able to ferret this out and be able to pluck out tunneling activity or covert channel activity amidst normal HTTPS traffic from plain old web browsing. And I know I'm getting up against time, and I'm certainly available to do a more in-depth deep dive demo for those of you that would like to see it further. This is an example of the tripwires that we have that exist for Detect for Networks. So this the network-based packetized version of our AI models. So rather than determining what could be bad based on a detection that says this domain is bad, or this port is bad, or this file hash is bad, you have a collection of detections that are telling a greater narrative, and they're leveling up the threat and certainty score on a particular host. So as an example, I might see suspect domain activity, followed by a malware update, followed by Tor activity, followed by an internal darknet scan on port 443. That collection of events is pretty interesting. Any one of these in and of themselves, outside of maybe ransomware, might not be all that interesting. It might be something that is benign or a host doing just generally what it is supposed to do. But when you start to group these detections together, it tells a greater narrative and provides a better mechanism for prioritization for an analyst. This is, and I think I'll just close with this because we're right up against the hour here, and I really appreciate for those of you who could join, and I don't want to draw this out, but this is an example of how that works. This is an actual breach that was stopped. This is an example of what life would be like in a zero trust environment where you go back and you recall this data, but it's relatively uninteresting until you find that you've had a breach. So externally, there was some reconnaissance done against some VPNs, FTPs, and webmail that was sourced from Russian IP subnets. Obviously, it was uninteresting because it was all external. No one was really paying attention to it. But it was visible in IR when we went back to correlate this to the event. So it's important to know that it started 6 days, up to 6 days, somewhere in and around that time frame before the actual breach. So here at this point, we have initial access via sonic wall. We had a number of things that were detected on an original source host. So a port sweep, an RPC recon, file share enumeration, automated replication, which is worm-like activity. There were more detections, more activities that were observed, novel admin share, malicious tool copy. At this point, the host was under observation. So there were some domain queries that were issued, LDAP, RDP, port sweep detections triggered, RPC recon, the usual suspects. So from this point on, an automated response was triggered. Vectra triggered the EDR to isolate the host and stop the remainder of the account progression. Stolen accounts were reset and prevented this device from actually exfilling whatever data it was able to siphon out. Then from there, they went back, and that's where they tied this back. But this went relatively undetected because when you're dealing with external networks, there's a lot of things happening, a lot of bad or malicious activities, but your expectation is that's not going to get through. So we can't busy ourselves up with just running down all of these things. But in this case, there was that sonic wall VPN vulnerability which got through. So I will stop here and I'll turn it back over to Alex. I really appreciate everyone's involvement, and thank you very much.
Awesome. I'd like to thank all of our participants as well as Robert for being with us today. I hope the information you received during this webinar has been helpful to you and your organization. As a reminder, everyone will receive a recording of the presentation in a follow-up email. If you have any questions or would like to request more information, feel free to contact the Vectra AI team at Caresoft. Our contact information is being displayed on your screen, so please don't hesitate to call or email us. If you would like to provide feedback on today's webinar, a few survey questions will be on your screen momentarily, so please stay on. Thank you and have a great day.